January 11th, 2023, 4:45 in the afternoon, Waller County, Texas. A man walks into his parents' house and says something. Not an argument, not a confession. Just words, the kind that made two people drop everything and move. They crossed the property toward the small cabin behind their house, the cabin where their son lived, where his new wife lived. They opened the door. Inside they found Anggy Diaz. Deputies arrived to a scene the sheriff would later call very bloody and gruesome. Her husband was still on the property. He hadn't run. Jared and Anggy had been married for exactly 3 months. 3 months. A local judge had just married them. They moved into that cabin, steps from his parents' door, beginning what should have been the start of something. Instead, it was the end. Anggy was 21. She'd come from Nicaragua, working 2 jobs to send money home for her mother's cancer treatment. People who knew her said she lit up every room she walked into. And she was killed, brutally, inside her own home, by the one person she had just chosen to spend her life with. What did Jared say to his parents that afternoon? Why did this marriage collapse into violence this fast? And what did the evidence inside that cabin actually reveal? That's what we're going to unpack. Because tonight, we're going back to Oak Hollow Boulevard. And we're not leaving until we understand everything the public record can tell us about what happened inside that door.
Visitors consoled each other at the growing memorial for Anggy Diaz this evening outside of the meat market where she'd worked for the last 3 years until Wednesday. The 21-year-old was allegedly killed that day by her newlywed husband, Jared Dicus, who the Waller County Sheriff says decapitated his wife with a kitchen knife at the couple's home.
The marriage had been recent, formally, publicly, officially new. In October 2022, Jared James Dicus and Anggy Diaz were married in Waller County. The ceremony was performed by local judge Trey Duhan. It was a legal, documented beginning. 2 people in their early 20s starting what was supposed to be a life together on a piece of family land in southeast Texas. Judge Duhan would later say publicly that he was shocked and saddened by what happened. That reaction carries its own weight. He had stood in front of them. He had performed the ceremony. Whatever he saw that day gave him no reason to anticipate what would follow in less than 90 days. After the wedding, Jared and Anggy moved into the smaller cabin behind his parents' main house on Oak Hollow Boulevard. It was their home, separate from his parents, but connected to the same property. Close enough that a walk between the two took less than a minute. By January 11th, 2023, they had been husband and wife for roughly 3 months. Not years, not a decade of accumulated damage or slow erosion. 3 months. The distance between their wedding and the moment deputies were called to the property was barely a season. That compression is the thing that doesn't let go. Before any of what followed, there was Anggy Diaz. She was 21 years old. She had come from Nicaragua, built herself into Texas life, and by all accounts was moving forward with purpose, not drifting, not waiting, working, multiple jobs by some accounts, and sending money back home to help cover cancer treatment for her mother. That detail is not peripheral. It tells you something specific about who she was. A 21-year-old immigrant, not yet fully established, still figuring out how to make things work in a new country. And she was already carrying responsibility for someone else's survival. She wasn't just trying to build her own life. She was simultaneously trying to keep someone else's going. People who knew her described her with the kind of language that gets used when a person leaves a mark without trying to. Hard-working, bright. A presence that was felt. She had worked at a local convenience store. She had colleagues. She had a mother back home who was sick and needed her. She had plans, in whatever form 21-year-old plans take. Loose and possible and real. That context matters because it changes what the crime destroys. When reporting on a homicide focuses only on the death, the victim exists in the story only as the ending. Anggy did not exist as an ending. She was in the middle of something. The two jobs were not temporary. The money going home was not occasional. These were sustained obligations, carried daily, by a young woman who had crossed a border and built a routine and was using that routine to keep someone she loved alive. The marriage was part of that life, a chapter in it, not the whole story. And then January came. Jared James Dicus was also 21. Beyond that, the public record before January 11th is thin. There are no published accounts of a long history of documented violence, no prior criminal convictions that define a clear arc toward what happened. What exists is fragmentary and mostly surfaces after the killing. In November 2022, just weeks after the wedding, Jared was arrested on a DWI charge. What followed that arrest, according to prosecutors who would later raise it in court, was concerning. They alleged threatening behavior, erratic mood shifts. At one point, a restraint chair was reportedly used during the blood warrant process. Prosecutors described a man who became volatile in the hours after that arrest in ways that alarmed the people around him. There had also been prior calls to the family property, though public reporting never cleanly attributed those disturbances to Jared specifically, as opposed to another family member at the same address. What that adds up to is not a solved portrait. It is a partial sketch, a DWI, some alleged behavior afterward, a pattern of disruption that prosecutors found relevant, but that the public record never fully assembled into a motive. Before January 11th, there is no clean explanation. What broke that morning, or whenever it broke, happened inside a marriage and a cabin that the outside world had no real window into. The sequence moved fast. At some point on January 11th, Jared left the cabin and went into his parents' main house. He said something. Authorities described it as an alarming statement, enough that his parents acted immediately rather than waiting to ask questions. They crossed the property toward the smaller residence, the same cabin that had been the couple's home since the wedding, the place where Anggy's things were, where she had been that day, living the ordinary hours of a Tuesday in January. They opened the door. Anggy Diaz was dead inside. They called 911. The call went out to the Waller County Sheriff's Office and deputies were dispatched to the 200 block of Oak Hollow Boulevard. They arrived around 4:45 that afternoon. In the span of what was probably a very short window, alarming statement, walk to the cabin, discovery, phone call, response. The entire character of the property had changed. The land that had been a family space, a shared address, a quiet residential stretch near Magnolia, was now something else entirely. Law enforcement was on the ground. The case had broken into the open, and whatever had happened inside that cabin was now an official investigation rather than a family secret. Jared was still there when they arrived. He had not run. He had not fled the property. He was present at his parents' home on the same land. When law enforcement walked onto the scene and began to understand what they were looking at, deputies moved inside the cabin. What they found was described by Waller County Sheriff Troy Guidry as gruesome. That word, from an official source, carries weight. Law enforcement sees violent crime with a frequency that removes most casual use of the word. When a sheriff uses it in a public statement without elaboration, it tends to mean the scene justified the language. Anggy Diaz had been dismembered. Portions of her body had been separated. Reporting later confirmed that her head was found in the shower area. The home was covered in blood. Investigators believed a kitchen knife had been used. This was not a scene that left ambiguity about the severity of what had taken place. The violence was not incidental. It was extreme, sustained, and complete by the time deputies arrived. The question of what instrument, what sequence of events, what happened inside those walls in the hours before 4:45 p.m. was immediately overtaken by a more disturbing absence. Why? The how was visible. The evidence was there. What investigators said they did not yet have, what they could not point to in the initial hours, was a clear understanding of what had driven this from a marriage into this. Sheriff Guidry confirmed they believed a kitchen knife was responsible, not a weapon brought to the scene, something that lived in the couple's home. Deputies processed what was in front of them and then turned to the man still standing on the property outside. Jared Dicus was arrested. He had stayed. Whether that was numbness, shock, calculation, or something else entirely, he had not attempted to leave the property between whatever happened in the cabin and the arrival of law enforcement. Authorities later said that Jared confessed to killing Anggy. Sheriff Guidry confirmed the confession publicly. That single fact collapsed the question of identity entirely. There was no open investigation into who had done this. There was no alternative suspect, no contested account of how deputies came to focus on one person. He had been present at discovery, he had stayed, and he had admitted it. The case became, from almost the first day, a case about something other than authorship. Sheriff Guidry also told reporters that motive had not yet been determined. That statement, made in the same window as confirming the confession, created the space that would never fully close. A man had admitted to dismembering his wife of 3 months in the cabin behind his parents' house, and the official position was, "We don't know why." Not yet, investigators said. As it turned out, not ever. At least not in the form the public record could verify. Jared was booked on a murder charge and held on a $500,000 bond. That was the beginning of the court process, not the end. Within days of the arrest, surveillance footage from a local convenience store surfaced in reporting. The footage reportedly showed Jared at the store in the hours following the killing. The store where Anggy had worked. Jared was reportedly seen taking a beer. That detail appeared in local news and circulated widely. It was not the center of the murder case, but it was not nothing either. It was a timeline beat. A man's behavior in the hours immediately following the death of his wife, and what it suggested about his state of mind in that window sat uneasily in the public record. Prosecutors later moved to raise the bond above $500,000. In doing so, they put on record more than just the killing itself. They alleged that following that arrest, Dicus had made threatening statements and displayed volatile, agitated behavior. At one point, reportedly, a restraint chair had been required during the blood draw process. Prosecutors framed this not as an isolated episode, but as part of a pattern. A person who posed an ongoing risk and whose behavior extended beyond the single event of January 11th. The bond fight was, in effect, the prosecution's first public argument for how to classify Jared Dicus. The case was growing. The initial charge was in place, but what surrounded that charge, what the state was building around it, was taking shape in ways the public could see, and other things it could not. The next obstacle wasn't about guilt. It was about whether Jared could be tried at all. During pretrial proceedings, questions were raised about Jared's mental health. This was not an unusual development in a case involving extreme violence. The legal process includes mechanisms for examining whether a defendant can meaningfully participate in their own defense, whether they understand the proceedings, whether they can assist their attorneys, whether the trial can proceed in a way that is legally valid. A court-ordered evaluation was conducted. The evaluation found Jared Dicus competent to stand trial. That finding mattered. It closed off one path the case could have taken: indefinite psychiatric hold, delayed proceedings, the case stalling in a limbo that might have stretched for years without a formal criminal resolution. The competency question was raised, examined, and answered. The prosecution was cleared to continue. What followed was a case moving, slowly, through the machinery of Waller County's court system, toward some kind of final outcome. Whether that would be a trial, a plea, a prolonged legal fight, or something else was still unresolved as months passed. The court had determined Jared could be tried. The question was what that trial would ultimately look like.
Tonight, we're learning that when the murder allegedly occurred, Jared Dicus was already on bond. 2 months ago, Dicus was arrested and charged with driving while intoxicated in Montgomery County. According to court documents, a Magnolia police officer was dispatched to a Whataburger at about 2 o'clock in the morning for a disturbance. The employees of the Whataburger called 911 after they say Dicus became aggressive. Employees told police Dicus was in the drive-thru and wanted to use Apple Pay for his food order. The officer writes that Dicus argued with the employees about the payment, then tried to go inside the restaurant. The officer writes, quote, "He was so belligerent that they locked him out." According to the officer, there was a bottle of Bud Light in the console of Dicus's car that was 3/4 full and still cold. The officer writes that Dicus admitted to taking painkillers but could not give the name. After that, he was taken into custody and later released on a $1,000 bond.
On July 31st, 2024, a year and a half after Anggy's body was found in the cabin, Jared James Dicus stood before the court and pleaded guilty to her murder. There was no jury, no trial, no courtroom reconstruction of the events of January 11th. No cross-examination of investigators, no formal presentation of evidence that might have finally given the public a coherent answer to the question that had followed the case from its first day. The plea came as part of an agreement. Jared received a 40-year prison sentence. He waived his right to appeal. The verdict, the sentence, potential defenses. Whatever legal arguments might have been made on his behalf in a contested proceeding were surrendered as part of the deal. The district attorney's office stated that Anggy's family had been consulted before the plea was accepted, that the resolution they reached was one the family had been given a voice in, that they were not simply handed a conclusion without being part of the process that led to it. Because of the aggravated nature of the offense, Jared would not be eligible for parole until 2043 at the earliest. He was 23 years old when he entered that plea. Under the terms of the sentence, he would not see a parole board until he was in his 40s. The case was legally closed. Murder. Guilty. 40 years. But the plea was also, in a particular way, a door that had closed before certain things could come through it. A trial generates a record. Witnesses testify under oath. Evidence is presented formally. Arguments are made in public. The process forces a reconstruction, however incomplete, of what the prosecution believed happened and why. Cross-examination can crack open things that confessions leave sealed. Defense attorneys are compelled to engage with the evidence on the record. None of that happened here. The full account of what happened inside that cabin on January 11th. The sequence, the reason, the explanation that a trial might have forced into the open would not be coming. The public record ended at confession and plea and left the motive question where it had been since the sheriff first answered questions on the night of the arrest. Jared was going to serve his sentence, or so the record read in July 2024. The future pointed toward 2043, toward a distant parole hearing, toward decades. That future did not hold. In January 2026, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice reported that Jared James Dicus had died. The date was January 16, 2026. The location was the Wainwright Unit in Lovelady, Texas, where he had been housed since August 8, 2024, less than 6 months after entering his guilty plea. The cause was reported as a self-inflicted injury. He had served roughly 17 months of a 40-year sentence. The arc that the plea had written, decades of incarceration, a parole board in the 2040s, whatever form of accounting that future might have represented, ended without arriving. The prison term the court had imposed did not run its course. A BC 13 and Click 2. Houston reported the news, citing the Texas Department of Criminal Justice directly. It was factual and final. No further legal proceedings, No appeal he had waived and no longer could pursue. No future hearing. What remained was the record. The crime. The plea. And the damage that had already been done long before January 16, 2026, changed anything about the case's shape. His death did not answer what his life had left unanswered. The motive was still thin in the public record. The explanation was still not there. And Anggy Diaz was still gone, as she had been since the afternoon his parents walked to the cabin and found her. That part had not changed, and could not. Anggy Diaz was 21 years old. She had come from Nicaragua to Texas and had been building something, working 2 jobs, sending money home, helping keep her mother alive through cancer treatment from thousands of miles away. Those are not the accomplishments of someone coasting. That is a young woman holding multiple things together at once, her own future and someone else's survival, before she was old enough to have figured out what she even wanted her life to become. She had married in October 2022. She had stood in front of a judge and made a commitment and begun a life with the person she had chosen. She was 21 and she had a mother who needed her and a job where people remembered the effect of her smile. She had 3 months. 3 months of marriage on a piece of land in Waller County in a cabin behind a family home, before the morning of January 11th became the end of everything she had been moving toward. The court record now says guilty. It says 40 years. And then it says he died in custody in January 2026. The timeline is complete. The legal chapter is closed. But the public record never gave a full answer for why a 21-year-old woman building a life on 2 continents at once was killed inside her own home by the person she had married 3 months earlier. The sheriff said motive was undetermined. The plea removed the trial that might have developed one, and now the person who was there, the only person who was there, is also gone. What remains is Anggy. What she was doing before the story found her. What she was carrying. What she would have kept carrying if January 11th had been an ordinary Tuesday and his parents had crossed the property and found nothing wrong. The cancer treatment her mother needed, the jobs she was working, the life she had not yet finished building. That is what was taken, not by a case file, not by a confession or a plea. By the morning, she walked into a cabin in Waller County and didn't walk out.